We have a really exciting keynote speaker to open up this session. This is Garret from Rowan University. He's a professor, a self-described professor, researcher, and activist, and an associate professor of communication studies. He has a sort of two-pronged research focus at the moment between alt proteins and the future of meat and communication of food justice and food tech justice, sorry. You might have heard of his book, which has an excellent title, More Than Just Food, Food Justice and Community Change. I like that one. And you might also know him from his many papers on the societal impact of cellular agriculture, including one that I think has been very informative and influential for many of us, which was co-authored by Robert Childs, called Democratizing Ownership and Participation in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, Challenges and Opportunities in Cell Ag. That's been a really wonderful resource for a lot of us thinking about how to approach our new emerging field. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Garret.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think I'm okay on this. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be here the last couple of days and hear all these wonderful presentations on the cutting edge of science and hear about some developments in industry as well as some work around public engagement. I come to this from a very different perspective. As a social scientist, I employ a mix of empirical and critical methods, things like surveys and interviews and focus groups, but also a lot of critical media analysis, ethnographic work. So this presentation is going to be a little different, but I really appreciate the space that's been opened up to have this kind of perspective brought to the table. So I want to thank all the organizers for this invitation. I also want to thank DALL-E, the AI image generator, for creating these Van Gogh images of scientists communicating with the public about cultured meat. So thanks to them for that. The title of my talk today is Who Hates Cultured Meat? And I'm just going to start off with a definition that's going to give a sense that the social sciences are quite different from the natural sciences, because you folks are always really good about getting clear and objective answers. But in the social sciences, there's always many words, and it's quite complex, right? So who hates cultured meat? We're going to see some faces of some folks we'll get to know a little bit more as this presentation continues. But it's a diverse assemblage of individuals, communities of interest, professional organizations. They're motivated by a heterogeneous set of sometimes contrasting and conflicting ideological principles and personal incentives. They exhibit attitude strength that ranges from firm to weak, and they make claims that vary in terms of the quality of evidence, as I'm sure some of you are already quite familiar. So we're going to get to know our friends, the agriculture minister in Italy and Vandana Shiva, among others, as we start to think through this question of who hates cultured meat. You might be asking yourself, though, shouldn't we be asking the other question? Who likes cultured meat, right? That's usually the question that's asked. That's the question you want to know, right? And this has been the question that many folks in the social sciences have been asking for the last decade or more. You know, these questions about what's your willingness to try or purchase, willingness to pay cultured meat as compared to conventional meat or plant-based meat and things like that. I know these numbers might be a little small on the screen here, but you know, the numbers vary, and the sampling matters, and the question wording and the nomenclature matters. It ranges in terms of, you know, who is interested in eating cultured meat. But I think big picture, what we've seen is there's about a third of people in most places that are quite interested, about a third of people who are not interested at all, and then about a third of people who are somewhere in between and on the fence. And this ranges, as I said, there's some differences in terms of national preferences. There's a data point there on France, much higher lack of interest, much lower interest in France. But big picture, we can think about this as about a third, and a third. And so this question, though, of who likes cultured meat has really been at the center of a lot of the social sciences I mentioned. And it's often based on this concept around leveraging what's called the diffusion of innovations, which is a theory from the social sciences about how social change happens. And the basic idea is that most innovations start with some innovators and then some early adopters, and if it reaches a certain threshold, a tipping point, then eventually that will, you know, diffuse all the way until this becomes a norm of society. And so researchers like Seja and colleagues from GFI, you know, argue that, you know, focusing here on these early adopters and these innovators will help us understand the public's purchasing of, they're talking about plant-based meat here, as well as priming for future purchasing of cultivated meat once it becomes available. And so with that framework, a lot of the kinds of questions folks ask are, what can we know about these early adopters and innovators? What's the consumer profile? What's the persona? What are the products that they're most interested in? How can we message to them in order to get them on board and then to help that diffusion process along? So this is all really valuable stuff. I've done some work in this area. I know others we might hear from as well doing work in this area. But the argument that I'm going to be making today is it's not quite enough. And we should also be asking this question of who hates cultured meat, or at least who's not interested, as well as who hates cultured meat. I'm interested in these red lines here, right? That third of the population in most places that is concerned all the way up to vehemently opposed. And why should we be asking this why should we be asking this question? Because the curve of the diffusion of innovations, it doesn't always diffuse, right? In fact, most innovations fail. Right? Diffusion is an atypical outcome. These are some authors in Health Affairs writing about this. And what we often see is that unworthy innovations sometimes diffuse, so things that we think shouldn't diffuse to society become the norm, as well as very often effective innovations are stymied. Right? And so what I think we should be asking alongside this question of, how can we get these early adopters interested is, what's going on here? What is happening such that many innovations and potentially cultured meat are failing to diffuse? And so that means focusing not just on the innovators and the early adopters, but also on what in the diffusion of innovations parlance is called the laggards, as well as the late majority, the folks who are opposed as well as maybe somewhat on the fence. So how can we know who hates cultured meat and why they hate cultured meat? So as I mentioned already, sort of the dominant approach in the social science of cultured meat so far has really been grounded in, broadly speaking, what we might call consumer research and marketing psychology, right? And so again, really valuable work. I've conducted some research in this area. A couple key assumptions of this work is really focused on consumer behavior, and it recognizes that our behavior is shaped by a mix of rational factors, asking ourselves, is this something I'm interested in? Does this match my identity? As well as a lot of automatic thinking, that demographics and our social environments are major predictors of this decision-making, and that once we have this information about this group we're trying to reach, that we can develop marketing strategies. These are called the 4 Ps in marketing parlance: product, price, place, and promotion, that we can then use to guide that strategy. And so, again, useful stuff, but I don't think it tells the whole story. And so a big part of my presentation today is sort of a pitch for the social sciences that come from more of the critical interpretive lens. So here I'm thinking about disciplines like anthropology, sociology, science and technology studies, STS, my home field of communication studies. I'd also say elements of psychology as well, geography, right? These critical perspectives that have specifically looked at food and technology and brought a different set of assumptions to the core. So here in this work, they're really emphasizing in particular this idea that eating meat is a deeply cultural act, and that it's full of a term that I'm going to get to, all these terms and quotes I'll get to in greater depth, what we might think of as invented traditions, these deeply held rituals that are created by communities of interest. Another key assumption in this critical work is that people construct value-driven socio-technical imaginaries that shape their perceptions of the food system. This basic idea that the way we think about technology is not separated from our broader visions of what the good life is, of what the kind of society and economic structure we're interested in bringing to life. And then this one really is close to my own work in communication studies, that digital media matters here. We really have to take a look at how these discourses are playing out in digital and social media platforms, as well as keep an eye on this development of what some scholars have been referring to as radical diagonal coalitions, these kind of culture war, post-COVID coalitions that are not just far-right conspiracies, but include far-right conspiratorial thinking, but also bringing in a lot of more lefty kind of spiritualist thinking into some of these kind of anti-establishment coalitions. So I know it's a lot there. I know this is different, but I hope you'll stick with me through this journey for this conversation. So I want to continue, though, and talk about what do we know from the consumer and marketing psychology. Again, I'm not trying to say this isn't valuable at all. It is quite valuable, and there's been a lot of research in this area. Again, thanks to GFI, they keep this library of published papers and books on cultivated meat. And there's almost 150 records with the consumer preferences label there. And the vast majority of these are surveys, a couple experiments in there, again, on that lens of what are people's willingness to pay, what are the predictive perceptions and attitudes and demographics. So we have some insights here about, sort of maybe not who hates cultured meat necessarily, but who's not interested at this stage, with some that are leaning towards a stronger hate. So I'm just going to run through some of these bigger demographic trends that we see. A lot of this I've kind of had to reverse engineer, right? Because most of these papers are written as who likes cultured meat, who's interested. So have to go back into the data a little bit and look at the methods a little more closely to figure out who's opposed. So what do we know? Well, older folks tend to be more opposed to and less interested in cultured meat. Folks from rural communities, women, and folks with conservative political backgrounds. All things that I think are somewhat obvious and maybe resonate with some folks. People who are price sensitive, with less education, and as I said, there's certain national cultures that seem to have a stronger opposition, and the French in particular seem to just not be into this idea. So if we have any folks from France who want to help us understand that, I will say that there's been more research there than in some other countries that might also have stronger national cultures against. There's like one study on Turkey that also found really, a lack of interest there, but we can also see there's some, national cultures that have a stronger interest, the US, Singapore, et cetera. I will say this literature and my work in general is also quite biased towards the kind of American and European context. That's where a lot of the published literature is, and that's where my focus is. So I want to kind of bracket that and note that in this work. Another big predictor of who's not interested in cultured meat, vegans and vegetarians, at least when it comes to willingness to eat the product. So this has been really interesting. When we do survey questions that ask vegans and vegetarians, less than about 10% in most surveys are really interested and enthused to eat cultured meat. However, I have a survey that I just am starting to analyze the data from, and we asked another question, which is not just are you willing to eat it, but do you support the development? And there, those numbers were much higher. So about 30 to 40% of vegans, somewhere in that range, were on the kind of positive side in terms of, I support the development, even if I don't see myself necessarily as a consumer. So something interesting there. Other attitudes, this is big in the psychological research, right? We develop these scales and constructs, and we see do they correlate with a lack of interest, in this case, to eat cultured meat. Some big ones that might be familiar to you. Folks who score high on a sort of attachment to naturalness, not interested in cultured meat. General disgust sensitivity, not even just toward food, but just disgust in general. This seems to bring out that kind of disgust reaction for a lot of folks, so they're not interested in cultured meat. A bunch of measures that sort of measure openness from a personality perspective, openness from a new food perspective. So this is this measure of food neophobia, which is a construct that just looks how interested are people in eating new types of food. And then this other measure of food tech neophobia, which is folks' interest and openness to new technology in the food system. Anybody who's a little less open or more closed on those measures, not interested in cultured meat. We're going to hear, I think, a little bit more about this next point, and we've already heard a little bit over the last couple days. Distrust of industry, very much correlated. If folks don't trust industry, they don't trust something like cultured meat, and especially if you look specifically about questions around the biotechnology industries or sort of big food in general, a lot of distrust, lack of interest. And then a huge correlation, probably as strong as anything, folks who hold anti-GMO sentiments, whether it's for environmental or health reasons, mostly it's health reasons in a lot of the surveys, not interested in cultured meat. And I know you might be saying, well, technically it's not a GMO. They don't care. It's a GMO to them. They're not interested, right? Information seems to have an impact here. People who are just generally less aware of cultured meat are less interested in it. People who have less awareness or at least a less belief in the varied potential benefits of cultured meat are not interested. And we see this also in experimental work, interestingly. If more information, especially positive information, is provided, we see those numbers go up in terms of openness. But lacking that awareness, lacking that belief in benefits, there's less openness to cultured meat. And then also just folks who are not conscious consumers, right? Just don't think that what I eat, what I buy really makes a difference for the world. This kind of unconscious, indifferent consumer, those are folks not particularly interested in cultured meat and either. And then the last thing is all the kind of pending stuff, right? So a lot of people just say, well, I'll know when I can taste it. I'll know when it's, available, and I want to see longer-term safety data. It's been pretty much impossible to study things like taste. I know that I think Mosa Meat actually conducted an interesting experiment where they had folks try a burger that was labeled cultivated meat, even though it wasn't cultivated meat, and that had some influence there, but just a big to be determined in terms of some of these factors. So, that's what we get from the consumer research. Again, some really valuable and valid takeaways here, that certain identifiable groups will be harder to reach as consumers, so it's really going to be up to the industry when and if it's ready to reach out to consumers to devote their resources accordingly. I think a lot of folks are going to try to focus on those innovators and early adopters, but if they're interested in reaching those folks who are a little bit more on the fence, they can address some of that with targeted information from trusted sources, as well as improvements in the classic taste, price, and convenience matrix. But what I really want to focus on for the remainder of the talk is some of the limitations of this approach and some of the alternatives that insights we can get from the more critical interpretive social sciences. Because this is work, as valuable as it is, that really relies on methodologies that treat eaters as individuals and underemphasizes some of these difficult to measure cultural and social network elements, right? The reality is we don't eat like we take surveys, right? Individually, discrete and separated from our broader cultural and social environments. It also, I think, overlooks the potential of some small but vocal minorities who can stall changes at the social norm and policy levels. And this is something we've seen, for instance, in something like the GMO rollout over the course of the years. So that's why, in order to kind of understand these loud voices especially, these strongly opposed folks who really hate cultured meat and want you to know it, I think we can learn a lot from some key concepts in the critical studies of food and technology. So I'm going to introduce kind of 3 big concepts that I hope might be useful as you go about most of your business in the scientific domain, and have these in the back of your mind as you think about engaging with the public in the future. So the one is the valuable central role of culture and tradition. This is a huge area of research, especially in things like the anthropology of food. There's a wonderful book by an anthropologist named McFiddes called Meat, a Natural Symbol, who writes about how meat represents control of the natural world, right? And that consuming animals is this statement of humans' power. This has also been connected in vegetarian sort of feminist critiques by folks like Carol Adams, who's explored how dietary habits and meat eating in particular are deeply connected to class distinction, class aspiration, as well as notions of masculinity and manhood, right? And so these cultural domains really central to how people think about food in general and meat in particular. And so what we see, and this comes from the work of a sociologist named Anthony Giddens, is that when folks feel like their traditions and their cultures are being attacked, they lash out and they respond. Giddens writes about this idea of all traditions being invented traditions, because all traditions had to start somewhere, right? No societies were wholly traditional, but these traditions are invented over the course of time, and they're often deeply connected to notions of power and structure within our societies. And when these traditions are confronted, the response is often fundamentalism, right? Fundamentalism is beleaguered tradition, Giddens writes, tradition defended in the traditional way by reference to ritual truth in a globalizing world that asks for reasons. And so that's, I think, a big explanation, if we have Italians in the room who can help us understand this even more, the Italian agricultural minister calling for this preemptive ban on lab-grown meat. Why? In the name of tradition, in the name of culture. I think concepts like this can help us understand where this is really coming from. It's defending tradition in that traditional way. You might say, oh, it's not rational, factory farming, and this is an it doesn't matter. They're defending tradition in this traditional way. Another key concept I want to introduce comes from more of the social studies of science and technology, and in particular the work of a scholar named Sheila Jasanoff, who writes about this concept of socio-technical imaginaries. And there's going to be a bunch of words on the screen here, but the big picture idea of a socio-technical imaginary is just this basic concept that when people think and engage with technologies, they're not thinking about them in isolation, but they have this sort of set of associations in their mind, cognitive and emotional associations that connect it to broader understandings of structure, of power, of institutions, and of economic and political platforms. And so they define socio-technical imaginaries as these publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understanding of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. This second point, though, I think is the most important point here, right? Is that these visions are not just about technology. Instead, they express a society's shared understanding of good and evil, right? So for many folks, particular technologies or maybe low-tech futures are connected to particular visions of what they envision the good life to be. And for some folks, and I assume many folks in this room, a high-tech future is the vision of a beautiful, wonderful, abundant life. But for many, that is just not the socio-technical imaginary that resonates with them. And we see these, these visions of socio-technical imaginaries coming from individuals and collectives, but they gain traction through this coalition building. So this kind of starts to lead us to the third key point is this coalition of groups that are emerging in opposition to cultured meat alongside other technologies of the modern age. And some of these folks, I think, make interesting, valuable, useful to engage with points. So this image comes from a sociologist named Philip Howard, who wrote this piece in Natured Food, arguing that cellular agriculture will reinforce power asymmetries in the food system. And his fundamental argument is, you've got the Tysons and the Cargills of the world, you've got big technology, they're at the forefront of this, and so it's unlikely that they're going to lead us to a sustainable future because he argues they haven't helped build the sustainable present. You see some of these same arguments coming from activist folks like Vandana Shiva, although we'll get back to her in a moment. She's a longtime anti-biotechnology activist who's spoken out about the sort of what she sees as the unequal political economy of this industry. Interestingly, we also see this coming from certain folks in the vegan community, the kind of hardcore anti-cell ag folks in the vegan community, some of these folks who even don't like the plant-based foods as well because they feel like it's reinforcing both a cognitive way of thinking about human-animal relationships that's contrary to their ideology, but also that it's supporting a set of industrial structures that have, sort of created the suffering of billions of animals, right? So what we can already see here, though, is this really strange coalition of groups, right? Anti-biotechnology activists, folks who are interested and concerned about the political economy of agriculture, vegans, right? How does this all fit together? And so for this last concept that I want to introduce, this comes from quite a recent work by some scholars named Callison and Slobodian, writing about these somewhat bizarre, seemingly far-right conspiratorial coalitions that have emerged throughout the coronavirus pandemic, but as they argue, are not just far-right, because they're actually bringing in a lot of folks from the left, right? Particularly when it comes to folks from the kind of natural, spiritualist, holistic, in our context, the local food domain. And so what they call this is diagonalist movements, as opposed to far-right conspiracies. So these are folks who contest the conventional monikers of left and right, and they are deeply cynical about the state of contemporary standard politics. They blend these convictions with spirituality and with a discourse of individual liberties. At the extreme, they say that all power is conspiracy, and they're attacking what they see as totalitarian structures. Things like big tech, big pharma, big banks, climate science, mainstream media, and political correctness, right? Now, I have my own critiques of big tech and big pharma and big banks as well, right? And so this is where, if maybe you've been seeing this as well, and some critiques of the pharmaceutical industry during coronavirus and things like that, right? I think many of us, have critiques of these industries, but at the same time, we're not conspiratorial anti-vaxxers, right? But what this coalition that's really been developing over the course of the last several years is bringing these folks together, right? And it's happening online, right? So I often say that one of the things I do for a living is spend time just watching people fight about meat on the internet. It's sort of an occupational hazard in a lot of ways, right? But if you spend enough time on the internet, you see these diverse coalitions of groups on podcasts like Russell Brand's podcast, who was, of course, recently accused of sexual assault. But for many folks, because of his, taking on of the big tech and big pharma groups, right, that was just more proof that he was getting close, right? And Vandana Shiva appearing on his podcast, connecting to these conspiracy theories about Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum and the so-called Great Reset, right? Folks in the carnivore influencer community, a lot of folks in this kind of influencer, natural food, carnivore community, and of course many kind of unnamed and unlabeled memes out there that spread far and wide telling us that Bill Gates is trying to get us to all eat immortalized cancer cells, right? So, I know a lot there, right? What do we do with all of this, okay? What do we do with these insights from the critical studies of food and technology? So one is, and again, speaking to an audience mostly of scientists, I just hope that you, as you're doing your wet lab work, you're also thinking about how this is going to engage and be absorbed in the broader public, right? That the cultural meanings of cultural meat must be incorporated into our scientific education and all of our public engagement. And to be aware that there is an obstructionist coalition that is coalescing and has the real potential to derail the entire cultured meat enterprise, especially if they're able to draw from good reasons to distrust the industry, right? So integrity matters more than ever, right? Because they are looking for anything they can seize upon to fit into their broader worldview, their broader socio-technical imaginary. Of course, this work comes with all sorts of limitations as well, right? A lot of the concepts I've been talking about today are really difficult to measure and operationalize, and so it's hard to act upon with empirical confidence, right? I can't, if somebody wants to ask me, how do we get the, conspiracy to stop, right? There's not a single answer there, right? These are big, diffuse movements that don't have one clear answer, although I'd be happy to talk about some strategies that might help. And of course, maybe I'm underestimating the brilliance in this room, right? Maybe there are going to be these technological changes and advancements that are going to make this economy of scale that shifts the norms of our food system more quickly than I expect. I would love to be proven wrong here, but I think no matter what, culture is going to matter a whole lot. So this is kind of the challenge I leave you with, right? Do we follow the diffusion of innovation S-curve all the way up, or do we follow the path of many of those innovations that have failed? And once again, what I really think we should be doing is thinking not just about those innovators and early adapters, but also those laggards, right? Figuring out who among that group who maybe doesn't completely hate cultured meat, right? Because the ones who really hate it, they're probably going to be hard to reach. But maybe those who are on the fence, who are skeptical, engaging with those folks, listening, taking the time to understand what their concerns are, and then talking about what you do, why you do it, and how you do it, I think it can go a long way to helping us better understand and engage with those who hate cultured meat. So thank you so much for your time and the opportunity to share this work, and happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the inversion of the way that these consumer acceptance studies are normally presented here. Really, really helpful perspective.
Thank you.
We have one question over there.
Well, I'll pass it first here. It's closer.
Or we can also start in the middle. That's a lot easier, eh?
Thank you. Thanks for a great talk. You talk about the diagonals of consumers, but how do the lobbies fit into this?
Yeah.
In that they're presumably there's a more strategic approach there.
Yeah, I think a lot of
that be tackled.
Yeah, I think a lot of the lobbies can be explained through more of that tradition angle, right? These are folks who have, if you listen to what the lobbies say, right? There's this, and it's hard to get. I know somebody was saying they can't quite get a hold of the Cattlemen's Association in the U.S., right? These are folks who are saying this is the way we live, right? This is our way of life, and they're really trying to defend that way of life. And so I think there are ways that they get brought into some of these coalitions, but I think they're also operating more through the traditional structures of power than what we see with some of these kind of diagonalist movements that move to the more conspiratorial range. So I think we need to kind of have a multi-front approach here, engaging with those folks through those traditional pathways, like lobbying, like political systems, because there's still a lot of folks who are opposed to cultured meat who are operating through those channels. But there's this whole other arena that's operating mostly in informal ways through digital activism and things like that. I think there's probably some overlap there, but I agree. I think there's still a lot of that kind of more traditional engagement through structures of power and things like lobbying. Thanks. That was a good throw. Should have made that catch. Sorry.
Thank you so much for the really, really interesting talk. I'm curious, you just mentioned that you're happy to, you don't have the answers of what to do, but you're happy to have some thoughts, and I'm curious what those are.
Yeah, so I don't know how many folks dealt with engaging with folks who were sort of deeply into the anti-vaccine movement over the last several years. Can I see a show of hands? How many folks engaged with someone who was deeply into the anti-vaccine movement? Okay, keep your hand up if you convince them. Okay, like 1, maybe 2, 3, okay? If they're deep, it's hard. And that's probably not really where we're gonna spend our time. And so that, you have to kind of do some triage. And so initial assessments via conversation, I mean, that's the big thing, right? You have to be willing to have conversations with people. So you start there. The only way there's gonna be any engagement is through conversation. But you have to do this sort of initial engagement to assess, do I have any shot here? And if you think you don't have any shot, your time is probably spent better elsewhere, and that relationship is not gonna get any better, it's probably gonna get worse, right? But if you think there's an opportunity, the first thing you do, give them an opportunity to talk. What are their concerns? Where are they getting their information? The best thing we can do, it can be a challenging thing to do, is find a place that they still trust, that might be thinking about things in a way that's maybe not even wholly on your side, but at least closer to your side than what they're going from, right? Source credibility is really huge here. It doesn't do everything, but I think that's probably the best place to start. And then repeated engagement. So it's not gonna happen through just one conversation, but a repeated engagement where people feel like they're not being attacked, right? So, hey, just wanna check in, make sure that every time you talk, you're not just bringing this up, right? Make sure you're still going for hikes together, going out to dinner, talking about other things. If they want to bring the conversation back, okay, but also sometimes steer it away, right? But if you're committed, repeated engagement with trusted sources and people who seem like they're somewhat retrievable, that's your best bet. Thanks.
I just have a very quick question myself, actually. Do you think that there's room for us to create new culinary traditions around alternative protein without being too top-down?
Yeah.
And then inviting resistance this way?
I think a lot can be done through in the presentation this morning, talking about the food and science lab I really loved, right? When we're able to, you gotta get people cooking, right? And so I do think a lot can be accomplished by good products here. And yeah, new culinary traditions, new versions of old culinary traditions. I think, working through the food side, I think most of us in this room probably come more from the science side and the technology and the innovation side, right? But most folks are not gonna be those conscious consumers who are even convinced by the environmental benefits and animal benefits and things like that. The culinary side matters a lot. So yeah, I think, letting many flowers bloom, right? Of bringing folks with culinary skill, that's the goal, that's the hope. But I think we have a ways to get there. So I think we need to do some of this front end work before we can even have that opportunity. But sure, that's the dream, right? New traditions. All traditions are invented traditions. So let's make some new traditions with cultured meat.
That's a really wonderful note to end on. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you.